If you don't mind, I'd like to start off with a simple prayer. Lord, thanks for getting me here, and help me to speak to everybody here. Speak to them words that they need to hear, that you want to communicate, not necessarily the ones that I want to communicate. Thank you, God, for the great gift of bringing me here to speak to these people about this subject and bring me back to New Mexico. Amen. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
So, yes, I am Brian Gerbaksani. I actually grew up in New Mexico, so it's a big honor to come back. I haven't been here in 6 years, and I was praying for a way to get back. I have a family of 4 now, and so as some of you who've made the transition know, you go from paying for 1 to paying for 4, so that wasn't possible. But I really thank Wes and Deb and the ASA for sponsoring me to come. So I'll start off beyond that, maybe, with a little story, personal story. So there once was a sort of odd and precocious little boy who, when he was 8 years old, figured out the size and scope of the universe, that we're just a tiny little world orbiting a very large distance from a star. And that star is one of many billions of stars. I went to Cornell, so I can say billions and billions.
Okay, I'm going to try to turn the lights out.
Okay.
We can't do them separately. Is that okay with everyone?
I think that's good.
Okay.
I'm probably. So, just on a tiny little piece of rock circling a star, billions and billions of stars, billions and billions of galaxies beyond that. And realizing that the universe was so many billions of years old, and I said, wow, I am really insignificant. And this, I just gave away some of the punchlines, so the little boy was me. I'm a little nervous because I've never done a talk like this before. Anyway, so I got a little depressed, and I thought, what does life really mean? It's meaningless. Fortunately, this little boy had a friend who was just as precocious, but a little bit older and much wiser. He said, Brian, you may be a speck, but you're a thinking speck. And that makes all the difference. And that's someone older and precocious little boy was Wes Grammer, who introduced me. So that's how I became an existentialist. I was brought up in a family of, we didn't really have any knowledge of God in our family. We weren't taught anything about it. We were brought up in a completely agnostic way. Mostly. So another little story here is Viktor Frankl. For those of you who know him, he was interested in psychology as a little boy, and just as precocious, and apparently he even corresponded with Freud, and Freud was so impressed with one of his letters in high school that he sent it to a journal and had it published. So he grew up in Germany, in a Jewish family. But he was told in high school, and this was when, skepticism and positivism and atheism was very much in vogue. And he was told in his high school chemistry class, life is nothing but more than a process of combustion. It's just a process of oxidation. And so Frankl stood up and he said, "Sir, if this is so, what can be the meaning of life?" And that was a sort of a formative question for him. And he grew up to find out that that was not true, that life is not just a process of oxidation. And he found it in under the worst possible circumstances. He and his wife and child and his parents were all shipped off to the concentration camps during World War II. And he wrote a book about it later, which apparently the German title translates roughly as Saying Yes to Life in Spite of Everything, the Psychologist's Experiences in the Concentration Camp. Here in this country, or in English, it was published as Man's Search for Meaning. He had a lot of interesting, which I think Wes and I both read in high school. We both went to high school in Albuquerque. And he had a lot of observations in there, and one of them was that, he said you could tell when people lost hope, when people stopped seeing the meaning of life in this concentration camp, because the light would go out of their eyes, and many of them they'd be gone in 24 hours. They would just die. Whereas the people who still had hope that even under the worst of circumstances there was meaning, could go on and endure, what you wouldn't really think was humanly possible, but they did. So I'm going to step back from that a little bit. I'm going to get a little bit more. And if anybody wants to stop me and have a question, just go ahead. I'm going to give you some background here on life and health and kind of what we found out in the last 30 years. Are we really nothing more than the process of oxidation? Well, that point of view led a lot of biochemists and geneticists to have a very materialistic worldview. Materialistic not meaning like, Madonna, the material girl going to the mall, but meaning that the material is all there is. And so that led to a view called genetic determinism. Well, if you really are just a process of oxidation is carried out by enzymes in your body. Those enzymes are encoded for by genes. So if you know the genes, then you know the man. That was the idea. And these days, there are still many famous and loud proponents of genetic determinism. Steven Pinker at Harvard, many others. And oftentimes you can hear them talking about, evolution, what I call evolutionary psychobabble. It's nothing against the theory of evolution, but, sort of what's done in its name sometimes. These are cocktail party conversations about why do people get married, why do they get divorced, why do they kill themselves, why do they not kill them. You can come up with an evolutionary reason for pretty much anything you want. Turns out that genetic determinism has been a disappointing hypothesis because typical genetic effect sizes are pretty small. So if you survey the literature, you'll find that sometimes they can find genes behind a certain condition or behavior, but typically they're in the 10 to 20% range. So in other words, if you have the right genes or the wrong genes, it gives you about 10 or 20% more risk of having that condition, say depression or a personality disorder or early onset diabetes or something like that. They're really small. Environmental effects are typically one order of magnitude larger. So, maybe you have a set of genes that predisposes you to lung cancer. Well, that might give you a 20%, increased risk, but smoking will give you a way higher risk than that. The other thing to know about genetics is that genetic effects are typically deterministic. Probabilistic and not deterministic. So, having sort of the wrong set of mutations in your genes or something like that will only increase your probability. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to turn out a certain way. Genes often moderate environmental effects. They don't determine them. And if you're curious more about basic genetics and you don't really have any background in that, my friend Baldwin Way and I wrote a primer on it, which you can download freely from the internet. It's about it answers a lot of basic questions. So let's look at this a little bit more closely. And one of the things that was surprising to me, going from physics to epidemiology and life sciences and molecular biology, is that in physics, if you have Maxwell's equations, that's how waves propagate. That's how the electromagnetic fields operate. It never really changes. But in molecular biology, that's not so at all. Even in the most clear-cut cases, genes don't really tell the whole story by a long shot. For example, cystic fibrosis. Before I went into this field, I thought, well, cystic fibrosis it's a horrible disease. It's a genetic mutation. If you're born with that mutation, that's it. You're going to have a miserable life, difficult life. It turns out there's a lot of variation. So here's a paper from some of the commentaries from the 2009 review. But this paper was actually done in 1990. So this is a very common, 70% of cystic fibrosis cases have this mutation. They're delta F508. That means they're missing a phenylalanine at position 508 in that chloride transporter in their lungs and other places. So there is some genetic determinism to this in the sense that among all the people that they studied, those who have 2 copies of this mutation will definitely have pancreatic insufficiency. That's a fancy way of saying that your pancreas doesn't work properly. Although one person did not. However, this is a measure of forced expelled volume, so this is a measure of your lung capacity, how well your lungs work. You can see that, and this is age down here, there's a huge variation in how well people's lungs work for the exact same mutation, exact same age. You get a huge variation in function. And so Francis Collins, who's now the director of the NIH and also an ASA member and supporter, is probably our most famous member. So he was the one who discovered this mutation in cystic fibrosis. He was one of the first labs. His lab was one of the first labs to find an actual pinpoint the mutation behind a genetic disease. And they were, when they started looking into this more deeply, they were shocked to find, some people with cystic fibrosis are actually running marathons, and some people, have a hard time, getting out of the house. So where is that extra source of variation? It's definitely not the genes determine the person. Here's another study that's been famous. This is something a little bit more psychological. So, do your genes have an influence on depression? And it turns out, yes, they do, but it's quite moderated by the environment. So, 5-HTT is a serotonin transporter in your brain. So, a lot of the new antidepressant drugs, like Prozac and Wellbutrin and so on, they work by modulating your serotonin. So it turns out that if you have 2 short alleles, a shortened version of this gene, then you will have a risk of depression, having a major depressive episode. But only if you have sort of attendant life stressful events. So if you have 4 or more, serious stressful events, death of a close loved one, divorce, financial hardship, things like that. The more of these you have, then the more it potentiates your risk of depression in the S genotype, but not in the L genotype. So, because you have that mutation in the serotonin transporter in your brain, doesn't mean that you're going to be depressed. It doesn't determine that that's what you are. It might confer a little extra risk. Now, so this paper was published in Science. That's sort of the big journal that you want to try to publish in. And another group came along and tried to replicate it. And this was published in 2005. And they did replicate it on a larger sample size, but it was a little bit more nuanced than sort of the flashy paper. You still have an increased risk of depression. And men and women work differently. So as everybody sort of common sense knows, but sometimes it takes academics a little bit longer to figure these things out. But, so if you have, so these are serious life events. So if you have no serious life events, it doesn't really, having the short allele or the long allele, it's not going to affect you. So there's biblical principles about how to live, how to structure your environment so that you live in a healthy way. And as science studied this, and it turns out that actually scientists are beginning to study this. It was quite amazing to me. I mean, I grew up in a very academic household. Both my parents have PhDs. Science and faith, probably what a lot of what draws many of you here is that wow, science and faith are can they be integrated and so on. The worldview that I grew up with was no, absolutely not. They're not completely different things, and I was taught not to believe the one. But it turns out that these things can be studied in an organized scientific way. Now, so let's take a look at it. So here are some of the biblical maxims, and I've quickly shown a verse if you want to look it up. So faith and hope are important, as the Frankl story that I shared. When people lost hope, they died very quickly in the concentration camps. But there's more studies of that. Love, and love in the context of social relationships, so regular social interaction with people. Jesus' last words before he died to his disciples were, love one another, remain in a loving relationship. Marriage, Ephesians here, forgiveness, gratitude. One of my favorite verses, 1 Thessalonians, rejoice always, pray without ceasing, and everything give thanks. It's more blessed to give than receive, so giving. Living with purpose versus just self-gratification. So these are 7 or 8 principles here. Let's see what science has to say about that. So recently, I can't remember her first name, but this woman at BYU published a really nice this is a meta-analysis. So she gathered a bunch of analyses together, pooled all the data about social relationships. How do social relationships affect your health? Are you engaged with the community? Do you have loving relationships around you? What is the effect size of that? Again, talking about this effect size, does it increase your risk for heart disease, cancer, so on? Is the effect in the 10 or 20% range, or is it much lower than that? Well, she found out that overall social relationships were at the top. The effect sizes were comparable to smoking. If you have poor social relationships, it's equivalent to smoking 15 or more cigarettes a day. It's really serious. It's more than excessive alcohol consumption or obesity.
What's your x-axis?
This is the effect size. So, there's increased risk, I guess, in terms of percent. Pretty sure. I have the paper with me on this computer. You can look it up. Marriage, all of us who are married or have been married, you know that marriage isn't easy. Husbands, love your wives. Wives, respect your husbands. So now I'm giving you some of these names maybe so that, I don't know how many of you have notes. So you can ask for the slides from me maybe later. A lot of this research is not beyond just the educated layperson. You can go to the internet and look this stuff up yourself. So I'm giving you some of the key names that maybe you can say, oh, I'm interested in that topic. Look up more about it. Go to this person's website, look up their papers. So Timothy Smith at the University of Utah studies the risk of cardiovascular disease, atherosclerosis, and marriages lacking love and respect versus those that do. And of course, the risk is much higher. Any married person can tell you that in an instant. Janice Keekholz-Glaser at Ohio State studies stress marriage, and she did an interesting experiment. I'm not sure how she got approval for this, but she actually she she did a wound healing experiment. So she would actually induce a blister on people's skin, married couples, and then take a blood sample from around that wound and study the immune system and the cytokines and so on. People who had difficult relationships, marital relationships, had much more of an inflammatory response. And so the inflammatory response is what leads to, heart disease and obesity and all the bad things. I mean, I think initially, sometime way long time ago, sort of a hyper-inflammatory response was good when you got attacked by a bear or something like that, and you needed to make sure that you didn't get an infection. But these days, a lot of times it's not so good. Some of these studies are really fun. Giving in health. So you can this woman who's now at the University of British Columbia, she did a study of money and health. So she'd have these studies where she'd get a bunch of volunteers and she'd give them all $20. Here's $20. And she'd instruct them, now take this $20 and go out and spend it on yourself. So they would, and they'd have a good time. And then another group, she'd say, I want you to take this $20 and go out and spend it on somebody else. Okay? And they would. And then she would look at their health responses, how satisfied they were with their experience with life afterwards. And the ones who spent the money on other people were much happier and had much better health responses to the experiment. This is a cute paper that she did. Happiness runs in a circular motion. So pro-social, sort of the buzzword in this type of research is pro-social. So that's giving, basically, giving to others, giving to those in need. So pro-social spending leads to happiness, which is a cute little diagram. It's in the Journal of Happiness Studies. Before I started preparing for this talk, I didn't know there was a Journal of Happiness Studies. Now I know it. And now you know it. You can look up those papers and read some of the happy advice. This is a report that she helped to do for NBER, National Bureau of Economic Research. So it turns out these are correlation coefficients. So pro-social spending predicts well-being. It's very highly correlated well-being in almost all countries that were studied. These gray ones weren't studied. I guess there was some objection made that, maybe this is just applies to weird countries, weird or Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And so they repeated this. They took a close look at Uganda, where the pro-social spending there is very different than here. Here a pro-social spending might be, buying some flowers for somebody you know who's in the hospital, or buying a gift for somebody. In Uganda, it's more like giving somebody some of your sweet potato harvest, or paying their medical bills because they need to go to the doctor and they don't have a dime. And so even though the personal and pro-social spending habits are very different in Canada and Uganda, the effects are the same. This is an interesting study, about giving in health. So 846 people in Detroit, Michigan. Wow, those people kind of need all the help they can get these days. This guy, I think he's in Buffalo, and you can look up the paper. It was just published in 2013 here. So he did a 5-year study, sort of following people, and he followed people long enough that some of them died. So this is actual survival. So it shows percent of people that he was following who are still living, and you can see. And he gave them a questionnaire and divided them into 2 groups: those who, on a regular basis, did something to help others. Now that could be somebody in their family, somebody who needed it, maybe caring for somebody with Alzheimer's, or it could be helping at a church, it could be helping, in a house for the homeless or something like that. But something who did it on a regular basis. And other people, who that really wasn't part of their life. And he noticed an interesting thing, that in the people who were givers, Well, they seem to die just as quickly as the, well, not quite as quickly, but I don't think it was statistically significant between these two. But the interesting thing about them was that their giving buffered the effects of stress. So in the non-giving group, the stress would kill you quicker. So if you had a high stress life for whatever reason, you had higher mortality. In the giving group, there was no difference between the people who had stressful lives and those that didn't. So the giving seemed to moderate the effects of the stress. It kind of removed the harmful effects of the stress. This guy, Robert Emmons, who's at UC Davis, he's been studying gratitude for a long time, which was news to me. I didn't know, you could build a career out of studying gratitude, but it's kind of cool. And he did an interesting experiment with students, and he said, it was very non-invasive, very judgmental experiment. He just wanted them to keep a journal, and he instructed them, one group, keep a journal and write down 5 things every day that you're thankful for, that you're grateful for. And another group, he said, write down 5 things every day that really annoy you, piss you off. And then a different group, he said, just write down 5 things that happen to you today, whatever comes to the top of your head. So that was a control group, so that's how you set up the experiment. And the gratitude group, obviously, their subjective well-being, they, after a while of doing this, they just felt better as a whole. They felt better about their community. They felt more connected with others. Whereas the control groups, obviously felt less well. But the gratitude group also had slightly better health. They slept better. They felt more refreshed upon waking. Physical pain was less if they had any, and so on. So gratitude is good for your health. Forgiveness and health. These are some of the names that you can look up: Daniel Lambert and Frank Fincham. I didn't get into their studies. It was harder to find studies on forgiveness and health, even though I know they've been done. And I think part of that is because it's maybe harder to set up an experiment on forgiveness than it is on gratitude. Right? Gratitude, or giving, right? You can give people the $20 and ask them to go spend it on somebody, or gratitude, you can ask people to think of nice things. Forgiveness, what do? You smack people around in a room and see which one's it's a little harder to set up. This is an interesting paper that just came out again this year. Happiness and a higher purpose. So happiness can mean 2 different things, and philosophers and psychologists divide it into sort of a self-gratification, hedonic happiness, or a eudaimonic happiness. Eudaimonic means striving for a noble purpose or a higher meaning. And so they divided people into 2 groups just with a survey. And I'm a little fuzzy now on how the experiment was set up, but they monitored gene expression. So this again is related to inflammatory response. You have a lot of inflammation in your system. And they noticed that people in the 2 groups who reported to be just as happy, yes, I'm happy about this, I'm happy about that, but maybe in one group you were happy about the new car that you got. Not that there's anything wrong with that. You might want to get a new car sometime soon. But those who were happy about, because they felt like they were fulfilling a purpose, a higher purpose in their life. And we noticed that even though the happiness scores were just the same, actually, between the 2 groups, the inflammatory scores were different. In the hedonic group, actually, they had more signs of more inflammation in their genes. Whereas in the, more pro-inflammatory action. Whereas, unless you're getting attacked by a bear, what you really want is sort of more of an antibody response. So antibodies are non-inflammatory. T cells inflammatory. So they had different gene expression. Now, I'd be the first to tell you that gene expression studies should be handled with a large grain of salt. We're going to have to wait to see how this gets confirmed. Because the data is very noisy. But it's an interesting idea. It's an interesting perspective. And this was organized by Steve Cole, who's at UCLA, so that's my alma mater. And he's at the Norman Cousins Center for Psychoneuroimmunology. And what's interesting about that, so Norman Cousins was the writer-editor who donated the money for this institute. And so if you look him up on Wikipedia, you'll find out he was the one who sort of started looking at the connections between, the mind, the spirit, and health. He was dying of it. He was, given a life sentence. Basically, his doctors told him he had a year to live. And the first thing he decided, is that if I only have a year to live, I'm getting out of this hospital. Hospitals are lousy places to recover. And I don't know how many of you maybe have heard the story, but he got some of his friends in Hollywood. Alan Funt was one of them, the guy who did Candid Camera, and had him show old Abbott and Costello movies, some of the Candid Camera footage when it was first coming out, and he would just laugh, or he tried to make sure that he would laugh for half an hour to an hour each day. He said that's going to cure me, more than staying in a hospital and giving me whatever experimental medicine they don't know if it's going to work. So he helped start this idea of psychoneuroimmunology. So Viktor Frankl also, later in his life, he's sort of considered the father of the third great Vienna school of psychotherapy, which he called logotherapy. And that is that he felt like the root of much depression and unhappiness was because people don't have a fundamental purpose or some deeper drive. And he said that happiness can't be pursued. It must ensue from what you're doing. It's the very pursuit of happiness that thwarts happiness. So if you try to gratify yourself, and that sounds very much to me like one of the first verses in the Bible that I remember when I started believing it, which was if you try to save your life, you lose it. If you try to make your life happy, it's not going to work. Now, somebody could say to me, and people have over the years, and it was good because it made me think harder about my faith and things. You could argue that, all I've proved here is that we're a social species and we live in community. That, because we're a social species, because that's how we evolved, we operate better in community, we're happier, and so we have better biological, biochemical responses. So what? And I would say that, the data seems to go beyond that. But it does sort of bring up these ideas of, altruism. Is altruism built into our genes? Some people would say that it is, or is there something more? So the selfish gene hypothesis, which maybe many of you heard, which says that posits that all this is well and nice about forgiveness and giving and so on, but it's really just our selfish genes trying to propagate themselves. And people have done computational studies based on that. Computational studies of altruism. Well, let's see if we can get a selfish gene, basically, something on the computer to recreate altruism, even though it's operating selfishly because, the best the best thing to do selfishly to propagate your own genetic code or computer code or whatever is to cooperate with others so that you can further your own interests. And that's led to a lot of interesting stuff. I remember seeing these studies when I was in college. So the prisoner's dilemma is a social game based on, you have two prisoners, and if you can get them to cooperate, it's really the best thing for them to do. So their two prisoners are kept. The way the prisoner's dilemma works, it's an interesting concept. So you have two prisoners and they're kept in separate cells. If they keep quiet under questioning and don't rat on each other, then the judge says, well, we don't really have enough to convict them for a long term, so we'll give them a 1-year sentence, a light sentence. If one of them rats on the other and says, no, he did it, I saw it, and the other one stays silent, then prisoner A goes free. Prisoner B gets 3 years, he did it. Likewise, if the other one rats, prisoner B rats on prisoner A. If they both rat on each other, then they both get a longer sentence. So the idea is, from a selfish point of view, each person should try to rat the other one out. Because if the other one stays silent, then woohoo, they go free. If the other one doesn't stay silent, well, he was going to rat on me anyway, so I'd only get 2 years instead of 3. But if the prisoners both act like that repeatedly, then they're always going to get the worst sentence versus if they both kind of cooperated and stayed silent. So this is I don't know if how many of you saw the movie A Beautiful Mind or read the book. The book's even better. John Nash was the mathematician who sort of helped develop this type of game theory. And this is used a lot by a lot of think tanks, this type of game theory modeling and so on. Anyway, what emerged out of these algorithms was one of the main results was called TFT algorithms, or tit for tat. So they realized that algorithms that behave in a nice but retaliating and forgiving way tend to do the best. And they have a bunch of these little algorithms sort of playing in an imaginary computer space. Nice meaning you always approach, one algorithm always approaches another algorithm saying, I'll cooperate with you. And if the other algorithm, rats on the first algorithm, then it will retaliate the next time. But it will forgive in the sense that it will not retaliate after that if the other algorithm plays nice. So when people did these studies, they said, well, there you go. That's social altruism, right? This proves it. It's nothing more than selfish genes operating in a social way for their own benefit. That idea that, yes, some of these things are socially a good idea, no matter what the Bible says, is true. It doesn't bother me that God, man, and nature may have independently come up with the same idea. For those of you may have saw it recently, there was a discovery in these little plant hoppers that they have gears. Young ones have gears underneath their legs that help them to hop these enormous distances. So it turns out we never found a gear system in nature like this. So men and nature, or men and God, have invented the same thing to solve an engineering problem. That doesn't bother me at all. When you start getting more into this mind-body problem, you say, well, is that really all we are? Are we just selfish genes operating biochemically? Or is there something more? And this leads you to think about the brain and the mind. Now, there's a famous case, for those of you who might know it, of Phineas Gage. So he was a railroad worker, and he would blast, rock and mountains to try to make a level place for the railroad. And one day he had this tamping rod, so it's about a 7-foot tall iron rod, about 1 inch thick, that he would use to tamp down the dynamite before igniting it. And one day the dynamite ignited itself, and it blew the tamping rod through his skull. And he walked to town, and the doctor saw him. The doctor was quite shocked, and he lost some of his brain, but he lived. And in the literature, some of the stories you read. Said after he lost a good portion of his brain on this side, especially his frontal lobe, the story was that Gage was no longer Gage. In other words, he had become a different person. So there were stories about him brawling in bars, becoming an amoral man, not being able to get along with others. And this story has been used by a lot of, again, sort of materialistic thinkers in universities today to say, you can forget thinking about the mind and the spirit. It's just our brain. It's just it's a process of oxidation. There is no morality. It's your brain. Now, when I looked into this a little bit more, I realized that there's people who are saying this sort of hat, and some of them are big names. Antonio Damasio at USC and other places. They sort of edited the story with an agenda. Because it turns out that Gage did become Gage again, and he recovered. He recovered his social function, even though he had lost a large portion of his brain. He moved to Chile. He adapted to a new culture, language, and profession. He became a stagecoach driver in Chile. Now, he had health problems. He had seizures. But he became a moral, nice, got along with people man. So when I read the more, nuanced version of this story, or not even nuanced, I mean, so many details were left out of some of the other presentations that it's really almost a fabrication. So how many of you here have heard the story when you were kids growing up that Columbus, set sail and the church was opposing him and the sailors were afraid because he was going to fall off the edge of the world, right? I heard that's the way I was taught, right? Yeah. And those evil, ignorant church people, don't give them money, I don't know, I can't remember what the Spanish, don't give them any money, don't let them do it, it's heretical. So that story was made up out of whole cloth. It never happened. The sailors on Columbus's vessels knew that the world was round. You see years of names, there's the noble Columbus, sort of a sinister cardinal, a sinister look on his face. You're contradicting scripture. No, the cardinals actually told Columbus, if you want to get to India the other way around the world, you're going to run out of food and water before you get there, because we know how big the world is. If you're going to sail all the way around the other way, you're going to run out of food and water. And he would have, if the New World had not intervened. It was never true that large amounts of people in Columbus's day believed that the world was flat. It was never true. That story was made up. And you can read all about why it was made up in this book, Inventing the Flat Earth, Columbus and the Modern Historians, by Jeffrey Burton Russell. He's a history professor at UC Santa Barbara. And basically the people who made up this story lived in the 19th century, and they had an agenda. And some of that agenda had to do with, beating up on those ignorant church people. So, there's a lot of agendas around, especially when you talk about the mind-body problem. So here's a guy, Jeffrey Schwartz, he's at UCLA, he's a neuroscientist. And he's a big proponent, he's a Buddhist actually, but he's a big proponent of this idea that there is something, it's not just your brain, it's not just a process of oxidation, it's not just something biochemical, that there is something that inhabits the brain. And I've heard him lecture, and one of the sort of interesting examples he uses is that one of his interests as a neuropsychiatrist at UCLA is OCD. So people, obsessive compulsive disorder, people who wash their hands repeatedly and things like that. And if you do fMRI imaging studies of people's brains, people with OCD, they just have different parts of their brains active during simple tasks. And so, this is Leonardo DiCaprio, so famous celebrity, and he actually went to Jeffrey Schwartz and said, "I've got to play Howard Hughes for the movie The Aviator, and he had OCD. Can you help me to behave like him so I can portray him more realistically?" And so Jeffrey Schwartz said, "Sure, I can help you, but I want to do a scan of your brain also." And what he noticed was that Leonardo DiCaprio, when he got in character and he thought like Howard Hughes, his brain would light up the same way as a typical OCD patient. So, what's driving what? So to sort of finish up the talk, 'cause I think I'm running out of time.
Keep going.
So the little stories continued. So after my friend Wes, when I was 8 years old, I was not in despair and see the meaning in life, being a thinking person, and I became an existentialist. Existentialism brought me about, it brought me pretty far. It brought me through most of college, but at about 20, the existentialism that I had been living on was running out of steam. And I thought, if we are just a process of oxidation, if our more noble qualities are truth-seeking, seeking after truth and beauty and altruism and love, if our more noble qualities are just sort of a byproduct of our social revolution, it doesn't explain enough. It didn't explain to me, some of the great saints like Mother Teresa, who was just sort of becoming a known figure at that time, and the artists, the truth seekers. And I realized that there is something more. And so my brother had given me a Bible, and in that Bible we wrote the verse Matthew 6:33, which is, "Therefore don't worry about what you should eat or what you should wear. God knows that you need all those things. Seek ye first after the kingdom and its righteousness, and I'll add all those to you." And all there was to me becoming a Christian was just sitting in my room and saying, that guy was right. I should do that. That's really true. And then the rest of it sort of God took care of it, because I started to change on the inside. It wasn't something, I wasn't changing myself. I started to change once I acquiesced to that simple truth. The rest of the story in Viktor Frankl is that he never lost his faith in science, in mankind, or a portion of mankind. He maintained until the end of his life that his concentration camp experience could be applied everywhere else. He said, in any situation I've been in, there are people who are just scrupulous, and there are people who are decent. And, part of life is trying to determine, who is who in any situation. He lost almost his entire family, including his wife and his small child. He remarried. He married a Catholic woman, and they maintained religious services in both traditions and through the end of their lives. He had a daughter and a great-granddaughter and a great-great-granddaughter. And he continued to develop logotherapy for the benefit of mankind. So the conclusion that I've come to is that we appear to have been built, that we live healthiest when we live in a Christ-like way, when we live in loving relationships, when we live in a forgiving way, when we live in a giving way, when we have hearts full of gratitude. You can actually study people's, immune systems and their endocrine system and see that people respond better to these things. You're healthier. The data is not conclusive, but it is suggestive. The data is never going to be conclusive. One of the things that I realized becoming a Christian was that there are reasonable evidences for God, for Christianity. they're not conclusive. But faith is not blind. As one of my former pastors said, who was quoting somebody else, but I don't know who he was quoting, faith is reason grown adventurous. So faith is reason, it's not blind, but it's taking you a little bit beyond where the reason is. And maybe for the last part, then, I was going to read a little out of this book. So one of my favorite books of Lewis is one of his most obscure, not many people know about. It's called The Pilgrim's Regress. And it's about C.S. Lewis's own sort of intellectual journey to faith. And so in this book, it's an allegory like the more famous Pilgrim's Progress. And he has an everyman character, John, who sort of represents desire. And he travels with virtue. And they're in search for this mystical island, this beautiful island that inspires John. He's trying to get there. And they encounter all sorts of people along the way who represents, sensibility, which means practicality, and claptrap, which is sort of technology. Puritania. He starts out as Puritania and all these things. But anyway, along the way, he gets imprisoned by the Zeitgeist. So for those of you who know German, this is the spirit of the age. The Zeitgeist is this big, huge monster. It's like a mountain. And he has this property that he has X-ray eyes. When the Zeitgeist looks at you, he sees right through you, and you can see through other people too, and you see the intestines and what's moving in there, and the lungs and the bones and the blood flowing and the urine and everything. It's all quite lurid and grotesque. And so John is put in the dungeon of Freudianism, and the Zeitgeist is looking at people. They're in the dark and they're seeing all these, urine and the feces. It's all grotesque. And Reason, who is a warrior, a woman, has this huge sword, this magnificent blue cape. She frees John and the other prisoners. And she frees him by challenging the Zeitgeist, the Freudian giant, to a duel of wits. And the Zeitgeist loses. And so John is walking with her. And he's asking her questions about, the riddles that she asked the giant, what the meaning was. And they're talking, and she says, did you think that the things that you saw in the dungeon were real? That we really are like that? And John says, of course I did. It's only our skin that hides them. Then I must ask you the same question that I asked the giant. What is the color of things in the dark? I suppose, said John, no color at all. And what of their shape? Have you any notion, save what could be seen, save as what could be seen or touched, or what you could collect from many seeings and touchings? I don't know that I have, said John. Then do you not see how the giant has deceived you? Not quite clearly. He showed you by a trick what our inwards would look like if they were visible. That is, he showed you something that is not, but something that would be if the world were all other than it is. But in the real world, our inwards are invisible. They are not colored shapes at all. They are feelings. The warmth of your limbs at this moment, the sweetness of your breath that you draw it in, the comfort in your stomach because we have breakfasted well, and your hunger for the next meal. Those are the reality. All the sponges and tubes that you saw in the dungeon are the lie. John responds, but if I cut a man open, I would see them in him. Yes, but a man cut open is, so far, not a man, and if you did not sew him up speedily, you would be seeing not organs, but death. I am not denying that death is ugly, but the giant made you believe that life is ugly. And John said, I cannot forget the man who had the cancer in an ugly black world. What you saw was unreality. The ugly lump was the giant's trick. The reality was pain, which has no color or shape. Is that much better? Asked John. That depends upon the man. I think I begin to see. Is it surprising that things should look strange if you see them as they are not? If you take an organ out of a man's body, or a longing out of the dark part of a man's mind, and give to one shape and color and the other self-consciousness, which they would never have in reality, would you expect them to be other than monstrous? Is there then no truth at all in what I saw in the dungeon in front of the giant's eyes? Such pictures are useful to physicians. Then I really am clean, said John. I am not like those. And Reason smiled. There too, she said, there is truth mixed up with the giant's conjuring tricks. It will do you no harm to remember from time to time the ugly sights inside. You come from a race that cannot afford to be too proud. I'd like to acknowledge for this talk, God who sent me on this path almost 30 years ago. Wes and Deb worked hard to get me out here. The American Scientific Affiliation for the Plains Exhibit, and the inspiration over the years. I've been a member there for many years. I first saw the presentation on Columbus and the Flat Earth at an ASA meeting in grad school. My aunt, Elizabeth West Gardner, gave me a car to drive around while I'm here. My family at home, my kids, for letting me go. I want to especially thank some ASAers that I've been involved with, and especially Baldwin Wade, who's a grad school friend, and he's now an assistant professor of psychology at Ohio State. A very beautiful mind, good man, and gave me a